company of Americans from all races and walks of life come together to make a desperate final last stand in the frozen mountains of North Korea. Now that should be a movie. Hello, and thank you for watching today's episode of That Should Be a Movie. I'm C.W. Johnson Jr. Today's book I'd like to pitch as a movie is The Last Stand of Fox Company, a true story of U.S. Marines in combat by Bob Drury and Tom Clavin from Grover Press. Yes, I've already done a video about The Last Stand of Fox Company, but I received so many negative comments about my speaking that I realized it must be distracting. And the story of Fox Company and the characters involved is so fascinating and extraordinary that I decided to do another video, not only to delve deeper into the story, but also to better honor the Korean War veterans and their fallen comrades involved in this heroic action. And if you don't like my voice even now, you can always go over and check out my blog, That Should Be a Movie webseries.com. In November 1950, the first year U.S. involvement in the Forgotten War, known then as a police action in Korea, General Douglas MacArthur drove the North Korean People's Army almost off the Korean peninsula, ignoring China's warnings not to approach the border. In response, the Chinese Red Army sweeps in with over 100,000 men and quickly surrounds the 10,000 men of the 1st Division Marines near the Chosin Reservoir, or as known to the grunts, the Frozen Chosin. Like a snake, cut into 3 pieces, the Marines were surrounded in 3 places along the only road through the area by the Chinese at Kodori, Yundamni, and the peaks in between. In order to survive, the Marines must retreat, or to paraphrase General Oliver Smith, attack through a different direction through the Tokong Pass. This narrow gorge must be held at all cost, and the job is handed by Colonel Homer Lichtenberg to the 234 Marines of Fox Company, commanded by Captain William Barber. They hold the rocky promontory overlooking the pass for 6 nights and 5 days, November 27th through December 2nd, fending off wave after wave of communist Chinese assaults from all sides. 3/4 of the company become casualties before being relieved by a daring rescue mission led by Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis. Drury and Clavin do an excellent job covering the big picture of political and military strategy while bringing out intimate details of the Korean ground war. They make you feel the tension as the Americans can detect the approach of the enemy in the dark due to the smells of garlic, because the tea the Chinese drink to fight off colds, and the whale oil they use to lubricate their guns. The sound of the crunch of snow under the sandals of the communist. When the first attack begins at 2:07 in the morning, Drury and Clavin put us right in the action. The air is filled with the smell of acrid smoke and the sounds of bugles, gunfire, whistles, explosions, clanking cymbals, and frantic war cries for 4 hours straight. The Chinese yell, "Marine, you die! Son of a bitch, Marine, we kill! Son of a bitch, Marine, you die!" The smell of sulfur and ozone filled the air. Tracers lit up the night sky. At times, the Chinese were as close as 8 feet. Because of the acoustics of the hill, men who were on other parts of the perimeter did not know the attack had begun and were in the sleeping bags when the Chinese approached. They are grabbed and dragged off into the night as prisoners. The human wave attacks the Chinese made them such good targets that it reminded men of target practice at Camp Pendleton. At one point, the Chinese held the crest of Fox Hill, but small islands and Marines were still scattered in their ranks, firing left and right. At another point, Barber ordered his men to stay in their holes, while American artillery pounded the Chinese that were on top of them. On the second night, The Chinese were so close that hand-to-hand combat broke out with knives, rifle butts, and even helmets. The Americans learned that the Chinese uniforms were so thick that men with carbines started aiming for their heads, since that was the least insulated part of their bodies. Despite using bodies for sandbags, the Americans showed humanity to the teenage Chinese conscripts they captured. By the time the fighting was over, the hill was surrounded by so many bodies that it was possible to walk around the perimeter without ever touching the ground. When the first night's attack was over, Barber realized that he had lost so many men and so much ammunition that it was safer to stay on the hill than to retreat. Colonel Lisenberg called for every cook, baker, clerk, driver, communication, and intelligence officer in coterie to reinforce Fox. Every Marine a rifleman was the motto. By the second night, the Chinese had mortars. By the third night, Barber had to tell his men that their chances of surviving the next 24 hours were slim. "We have nothing to worry about as long as we fight like Marines," he told them. By the 30th, Barber was asking for wounded who could squeeze a trigger to return to the front line. Barber instructed his platoon leaders to pair wounded Marines with uninjured men, or at least men as uninjured as they could find. By December 1st, Barber began ordering his men to take the fight to the enemy so the morale would return. There are several scenes from this action that are just waiting to be told in a movie. The wounded in the med tent had to keep weapons close, lest any Chinese suddenly open the tent flap. One of them, Corporal Walter Hiskett, began praying to God to save him, and then watched with joy as the morning sunlight began streaming through the bullet holes in the tent, signifying that he would live. Supplied by air, Barber would have to send men out on missions to recover supplies that had fallen outside the perimeter. At another point, an American lieutenant ordered 5 American corpses to be situated to look like 5 live Marines sitting around a campfire. When the Chinese attacked the corpses, the Americans ambushed them. Private First Class Lee D. Wilson was so thirsty that he single-handedly attacked a machine gun position so he could get a drink from a spring unmolested. Private First Class Alan Thompson snapped when a friend was killed and charged the enemy all alone, taking out a whole squad. The climatic scene would be when the relieving patrol, led by Lieutenant Colonel Davis, flushes out the Chinese into the path of the main American column coming down the road. The Marines of Fox Company sit and watch the trapped Chinese be wiped out by artillery and air power. The Chinese 59th Division would be so decimated that it would participate no more in the Korean War. In addition to the Chinese, the men of Fox Company had to fight the elements. Harsh winds, nicknamed the Siberian Express, blew unremittingly, glazing every rock with ice. Men cut holes in their gloves for their trigger fingers. The water in canteens froze and had to be thawed over open fires. Men were covered with ice. Their uniforms and mustaches were coated with frozen mucus. Temperatures plunged to minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit during the daytime and 30 below at night. The reader can feel the bitter cold as the Marines watch the milk on their cereal and even their spit freeze within seconds. Boots left outside of tents turned the blocks of ice. Men left their sleeping bags unzipped, since their moist breath could freeze the zippers closed, creating body bags when the trapped men are bayoneted in the sweep by the communists. Guns, including BARs, would misfire or jam because their firing pins were frozen, forcing men to use the bayonet. The frozen firing pins would force men to change weapons in the heat of battle. When men used their teeth to pull the pins on their grenades, part of their lips would come off, frozen to the metal. Gases in the small cartridges of the carbines froze in the cold, and clips failed to feed ammunition into the chambers. Men had to wait until sunrise to thaw the barrels. In order to keep the air-cooled light machine guns from freezing, men had to fire a burst-off every hour or so. Some men urinated on the barrels, exposing themselves to enemy snipers. Mortar crews had to move their tubes around so they would not freeze solid to the ground. The base plates for the tubes also began to crack from recoiling off the rock-hard ground. The batteries that ran the company radios were drained by the cold. Helicopters supplied radio batteries, but sniper fire was so heavy the helicopters could not land to carry off wounded. If the artillery support's location had been just a half-mile further, the guns would have been useless due to the weather's effect on the gas used for propelling the cells. Barber ordered his men to dig foxholes, despite the frost level being 16 inches. Despite their shovels bouncing off the frozen ground, the men were driven to dig by the knowledge that foxholes would provide protection. The weather had a particular effect on medical conditions. The lives of some wounded were saved because their wounds stopped bleeding due to the blood freezing. Morphine syringes would freeze, and the men would have to melt them by placing them under their tongues. Plasma, frozen in his feeding tubes, was useless, and the medics were careful about cutting open uniforms to look at wounds, lest they condemn the men to gangrene. At one point, the medics started using Scotch tape to cover the wounds. One of the main characters would be Captain William Barber. Barber, a Kentuckian who served in World War II, earning a Silver Star and Purple Heart on Iwo Jima, was fairly new to his command. At first, the men of Fox Company thought he was more tell than so, but he soon proved himself a capable field commander despite his spit and polished appearance. He trained the men, especially the new recruits, on the march from Drury, making them the fighting force needed to defend Fox Hill. During the battle, he fought alongside his men. At one point, he had to make the decision to tell his men to put all the enemy wounded out of their misery, since a Chinese tactic was to lay among the dead until an unsuspecting American passed by and killed them. When a bullet hit him in the pelvis on the second day, he stuffed it with a handkerchief and continued to direct the action. At first, he hobbled around using a tree limb as a crutch, inspiring his men. But when infection set in, he had to be carried around the perimeter on a stretcher, his men answering him with thumbs up. His Medal of Honor citation reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty, as commanding officer of Company F, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division, reinforced, in action against enemy aggressive forces in Korea from November 28th to December 2nd, 1950, assigned to defend a 3-mile mountain pass along the division's main supply line and commanding the only route of approach in the march from Yundong-ni to Hagori. Captain Barber took position with his battle-weary troops and, before nightfall, had dug in and set up a defensive along the frozen, snow-covered hillside, when a force of estimated regimental strength savagely attacked during the night, inflicting heavy casualties and finally surrounding his position. Following a bitterly fought 7-hour conflict, Captain Barber, after repulsing the enemy, gave assurance that he could hold if supplied by airdrops, and requested permission to stand fast when orders were received by radio to fight his way back to a relieving force after two reinforcing units had been driven back under fierce resistance in their attempt to reach the isolated troops. Aware that leaving the position would sever contact with the 8,000 Marines trapped at Undomni and jeopardize their chances of joining the 3,000 more awaiting their arrival in Hagori for the continued drive to the sea, he chose to risk personal loss of his command rather than sacrifice more men if the enemy seized control and forced a renewed battle to regain the position or abandon his many wounded who were unable to walk. Although severely wounded in the leg the early morning of the 29th, Captain Barber continued to maintain personal control, often moving up and down the lines on a stretcher to direct the defense and consistently encouraging and inspiring his men to supreme efforts despite the staggering opposition. Waging desperate battle throughout 5 days and 6 nights of repeated onslaughts launched by the fanatical aggressors, he and his heroic command accounted for approximately 1,000 enemy dead in this epic stand in bitter sub-zero weather, and when the company was relieved, only 82 of his original 220 men were able to walk away from the position so valiantly defended against insuperable odds. His profound faith and courage, great personal valor, and unwavering fortitude were decisive factors in the successful withdrawal of the division from the death trap in the Chosin Reservoir sector, and reflect the highest credit upon Captain Barber, his intrepid officers, men, and the United States Naval Services.
Certainly not trying to refuse to obey an order. It just seemed like it was the thing to do. My feeling for a mixture of pride in what we had done and proud of them for what they had done.
While the Marines of F Company were fighting off the Chinese, another main character, Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis, was making a name for himself, rescuing Hard Luck Charlie Company from Turkey Hill. By the third night of Fox's stand, Davis was contacted by Lichtenberg to go back the way he had just come to relieve Barber. Davis won respect from his men by commanding them from the center, a lesson he learned from Marine legend Chesty Puller, who taught him at basic training. Pointing to the retreating Marines, he told his men, "They're going down that road. We're not. Fellow Marines are in trouble, and we're going to rescue them. Nothing is going to stand in our way. Surprise is our essential weapon. Marines usually don't attack at night, so the Chinese won't be expecting us." During his relief mission, Davis ordered his men to build campfires so that the enemy would think they were bedding down for the night, when in reality they were continuing their attack. At one point his men came into hand-to-hand combat with the Chinese, in which rocks were thrown. Later he told his men that Fox Company held the road open for us, and now it's our turn to return the favor. He went 30 hours without sleep in order to accomplish his mission. His Medal of Honor citation reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as commanding officer of the 1st Battalion in action against enemy aggressor forces. Although keenly aware that the operation involved breaking through a surrounding enemy and advancing 8 miles along primitive icy trails in the bitter cold with every passage disputed by a savage and determined foe. Lieutenant Colonel Davis boldly led his battalion into the attack in a daring attempt to relieve a beleaguered rifle company and to seize, hold, and defend a vital mountain pass controlling the only route available for two Marine regiments in danger of being cut off by numerically superior hostile forces during their redeployment to the port of Hainan. When the battalion immediately encountered strong opposition from entrenched enemy forces commanding high ground in the path of the advance, he promptly spearheaded his unit in a fierce attack up the steep, ice-covered slopes in the face of withering fire, and personally leading the assault group in a hand-to-hand encounter, drove the hostile troops from their positions, rested his men, and reconnoitered the area under enemy fire to determine the best route for continuing the mission. Always in the thick of the fighting, Lieutenant Colonel Davis led his battalion over 3 successive ridges in the deep snow in continuous attacks against the enemy, and consistently inspiring and encouraging his men throughout the night, brought his unit to a point within 1,500 yards of the surrounded rifle company by daybreak. Although knocked to the ground when a shell fragment struck his helmet and 2 bullets pierced his clothing, he arose and fought his way forward at the head of his men until he reached the isolated Marines. On the following morning, he bravely led his battalion in securing the vital mountain pass from a strongly entrenched, numerically superior hostile force, carrying all of his wounded with him, including 22 litter cases and numerous ambulatory patients. Despite repeated savage and heavy assaults by the enemy, he stubbornly held the vital terrain until the 2 regiments of the division had deployed through the pass, and on the morning of December 4th led his battalion to Hagari intact. By his superb leadership, outstanding courage, and brilliant technical ability, Lieutenant Colonel Davis was directly instrumental in saving the beleaguered rifle company from complete annihilation and enabled the 2 Marine regiments to escape possible destruction. His valiant devotion to duty and unyielding fighting spirit in the face of almost insurmountable odds enhance and sustain the highest traditions of the U.S. Naval Service.
The interesting thing to me was that, I had 800 Marines out in that condition for 3 days, 3 nights. There was not one complaint, one beef out of them, because they were going to rescue other Marines. There was no way of stopping them. And that idea of one for all for one, really stuck with me.
Another main character would be Hector Cafrata. The son of a Peruvian immigrant, he was considered a first-class screw-up. At one point, while digging a foxhole, his buddy tried to warn him that he was throwing dirt on the boots of Colonel Lichtenberg. He didn't care. Fortunately, Lichtenberg only cited him for having his rifle loaded with its safety off in a secure rear area. During the firefight, the Chinese were so close, Cafrata didn't even have to aim his M1. He just stood shoulder to shoulder with the 3 other men, emptying clip after clip into the Chinese. Twice he caught potato mashers in the air and threw them back. Another grenade exploded as he was throwing it back, but he kept on reloading and firing his M1. At another point, he used a shovel as a baseball bat, putting the grenades back. His Medal of Honor citation reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as a rifleman with Company F, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division, reinforced, in action against enemy aggressor forces in Korea on 28 November 1950. When All the other members of his fire team became casualties, creating a gap in the lines during the initial phase of a vicious attack launched by a fanatical enemy of regimental strength against his company's hill position. Private Cafrata waged a long battle with grenades and rifle fire as the attack gained momentum and the enemy threatened penetration through the gap and endangered the integrity of the entire defensive perimeter. Making a target of himself under the devastating fire from automatic weapons, rifles, grenades, and mortars, he maneuvered up and down the line and delivered accurate and effective fire against the onrushing force, killing 15, wounding many more, and forcing the others to a draw, so that reinforcements could move up and consolidate the position. Again, fighting desperately against a renewed onslaught later that same morning, when a hostile grenade landed in a shallow entrenchment occupied by wounded Marines, Private Cafrata rushed into the gully under heavy fire, seized the deadly missile in his right hand, and hurled it free of his comrades before it detonated, severing part of one finger and seriously wounded him in the right hand and arm. Courageously ignoring the intense pain, he staunchly fought on until he was struck by a sniper's bullet and forced to submit to evacuation for medical treatment. Stout-hearted and indomitable, Private Cafrata, by his fortitude, great personal valor, and dauntless perseverance in the face of almost certain death, saved the lives of several of his fellow Marines and contributed essentially to the success achieved by his company in maintaining its defensive position against tremendous odds. His extraordinary heroism throughout was in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service.
I did my duty. I protected my fellow Marines. They protected me. And I'm prouder of that than the fact that the government decided to give me the Medal of Honor.
There's a host of colorful and human supporting characters. There's Dick Benelli from Hell's Kitchen, who once beat up a school teacher for suggesting he was descended from an ape. He would be nominated for a Silver Star. Private First Class Homer Penn, known as Penn from Pennsylvania. A group of Minnesota boys who call themselves the Mini Gang. Billy French, who was delivering mail to Fox Company when the battle began and picked up a rifle to join the firefight. Phil Cookie Bavario, a cook who took his place on the firing line, proving he was a marksman before he knew what a ladle was. There are boys from Montana who kid and lecture the California boys, known as the California Clears, about the cold. Private First Class Lee D. Wilson, a veteran of World War II, who at first did not like being paired with a new boot, Corporal Eleazar Bellamariz, but eventually learned to respect him. And there's a soldier who had just received a Dear John letter. They are Native Americans. Corporal Howard Kuhn, a Muskogee Indian from Michigan. There was a Apache everyone called Big Indian. Amos Fixco, a Ute. Sergeant Clarence Tauble, a Blackfoot Indian who hated the North Koreans because they looked just like him. Whenever he walked by a POW enclosure, the NKPA prisoners would try to talk to him. There are so many Hispanic Americans named Gonzalez and Gomez that they all have nicknames. Each Gonzalez and Ernest Gonzalez had their own individual responses during roll call. Here, present, yes, ho. There are World War II veterans, and there are reservists and teenagers with hardly any experience who are inspired to join the Marines by recruiting posters, murals, and morale boosters based on the veterans. 2 African Americans, including Claude Peoples from Florida. The youngest Marine in Fox Company is just 16 years old. In Davis's column, They are Lieutenants Joe Owens and Joseph Caraba, considered the Warsaw version of Mutt and Jeff, and a Navy corpsman, Peter Arioli, who would be one of the last men to die on Fox Hill. One of the most interesting figures in this epic tale is Lieutenant Kurt Chunin Lee. The son of Chinese immigrants, Lieutenant Lee was known as a booster of a man with a chip on his shoulder, yet also as a by-the-book Marine and competent leader and fighter. Being the very first Asian American Marine officer in history, his respect for men like Davis and Lichtenberg was based on and grew as he watched them in battle. He was also very aware of American attitudes towards Chinese immigrants, having once watched a white man humiliate his father by spraying him with a water hose when he asked for directions. His father drilled in his sons a determination not to wash anyone's shirts. And Lee, a fatalist, was determined to prove himself and honor his family, his country, and his principles by dying in battle. As part of Davis's force sent to relieve Fox Company, he fully expected to die at Toktung Pass. Yet he carried out his duties proficiently as he led the Ridge Runners, a nickname given the Davis's battalion, over the frozen mountains of Korea through the night to save the day, despite an extra danger to himself, looking like the enemy. Knowing some pidgin Chinese, he was able to fool Chinese sentries into letting him get close enough to toss a grenade. He wore a pink, solely dropped air panel so his men can find him when they are in a tight spot. Also, so they would not shoot him for thinking he was one of the communists. It is recorded when some spooked Marines said an armed gook had entered the withdrawal call, someone just replied, "That's Lieutenant Lee. Try not to shoot him." What is even more remarkable is that Lee wasn't even supposed to be at the front lines. He had been wounded when a sniper's bullet hit him in the elbow a month earlier. He was going to be flown to Japan. However, like George S. Patton, he demanded that a soldier suffering from cell shock sew him a physical wound. When the cell-shocked soldier refused, Lee slapped him. Facing charges for assault, Lee went AWOL with another soldier, stole a jeep, and returned to the front lines. Lee's character could be explored through his relationship with Lieutenant Joe Owen. At first, Lee did not respect Owen because he believed he was too soft on the men, often looking out for their comfort.
He said, "Then you may call me Lieutenant Lee or Mr. Lee, but never mind this crap about calling me by my last name. You show respect to my rank." Jeez, that took me aback. I had never run into anybody like that.
However, when Owen put himself in the center of action to stop Marines from retreating, Lee began to respect him more. He was the only man that the headstrong Lee would turn to admit he needed help. For his actions in relieving Fox Company, he would receive a Silver Star. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity while serving as the platoon leader with Company B, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division reinforced, in an action against enemy aggressor forces in Korea from 27 November to 8 December 1950. Although sick and in a weakened condition from a previous combat wound, 1st Lieutenant Lee refused hospitalization and unflinchingly led his unit across treacherous frozen waste of Rocky Mountain ridges toward a beleaguered Marine company. Through his indomitable spirit, he contributed materially to the success of the epic night march of his battalion, which resulted in the relief of the isolated Marine unit and the securing of vital ground. On December 2nd, 1950, when the leading elements of his company were pinned down under intense enemy fire from a rocky hill mass, he skillfully maneuvered his platoon forward in an attack in the face of the heavy fire, personally accounting for 2 enemy dead and providing such aggressive and inspirational leadership that fire superiority was regained and the enemy was routed. On 8th December 1950, 1st Lieutenant Lee's platoon was pinned down by intense hostile fire while attacking south on the main service road from Drury. Observing that the heavy fire was inflicting numerous casualties, he exposed himself to the deadly fire to move among his troops, shouting words of encouragement and directing withdrawal to covered positions. Assured that the last of his wounded were under cover, he was seeking shelter for himself when he was struck down and severely wounded by bursts of enemy machine gun fire. By his daring initiative and great personal valor throughout, 1st Lieutenant Lee served to inspire all who observed him and upheld the highest traditions of the United States Naval Services.
And all this, the success of this very vital, is historic night operation was based on what I learned at junior ROTC. That's what made a success of this historic venture.
His comrades believed he deserved the Medal of Honor.
Say we were inspired. I hate like hell to say a word so high-flown, but we were inspired by Lee. He became the character of Baker Company 7th Marines.
While several American movies were made during the 1950s and 60s, none have made it into the American conscience, like Saving Private Ryan, Platoon, or Black Hawk Down. This is ironic considering that the Korean War and the experience of American military personnel there has been overshadowed by other American conflicts, to the point it has been called the Forgotten War. I believe this injustice could be righted with a good movie about Fox Company, possibly directed by someone like Clint Eastwood, Ridley Scott, Mel Gibson, Randall Wallace, Edward Zeke, or Steven Spielberg. Lest we forget the courage and sacrifice of our men and women in Korea, I believe that The Last Stand Fox Company by Bob Drury and Tom Clavin should be an epic movie. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments below what epic story from the Korean War you think should be a movie.